On a wind-scoured ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a solitary cabin stood buried in winter hush as snow fell without mercy. From the white blur, a pregnant German shepherd emerged, ice clinging to her swollen belly, each step trembling yet determined. She did not whimper or fall. She reached the door and waited, trusting someone inside still remembered compassion. If this opening touched your heart, tell us where you're watching from and share your town or state in the comments below. Your story matters here too. Early winter had settled heavily over Boone, North Carolina, the Blue Ridge Mountains wrapped in a relentless storm that blurred sky and earth into a single restless white, and at the far end of a narrow, winding road, a weathered cedar cabin stood braced against the wind as it had for decades, its porch light glowing dimly through sheets of snow like a small act of defiance against the cold. Inside that cabin lived Samuel Hayes, 68 years old, a retired Navy SEAL whose once broad frame had thinned into wiry endurance rather than visible strength, his shoulders still square out of long habit, his jaw sharply defined beneath close-cropped silver stubble, deep lines etched beside eyes that were a steady gray-blue, observant and rarely surprised. Years earlier, a roadside explosion overseas had taken 2 men under his command, an event that did not break him outwardly, but folded something inward, making him quieter, slower to laugh, careful with attachment. And since his wife Eleanor's passing 5 winters ago, the cabin had grown disciplined in its silence, every object placed with military precision, every morning measured, every evening endured rather than enjoyed. The storm that afternoon had intensified without warning, snow driving sideways in hard diagonal streaks that rattled the windows and pressed against the door as if testing the strength of the hinges, and Samuel was kneeling by the iron stove adding split logs with deliberate economy of motion when he heard it. A faint scrape beneath the wind, so subtle he first mistook it for a branch dragged across the porch, but then it came again, softer, uneven, followed by a pause that felt less like accident and more like effort. He straightened slowly, joints protesting but controlled, and stood listening with the same focused stillness that had once kept men alive in darker places. He did not reach for the old rifle mounted above the mantel, did not tense, only tilted his head slightly, breath measured, attention sharpened not by fear, but by recognition that something living stood beyond the door. When the sound repeated, weaker this time, he crossed the small room in 3 steady steps and opened the door into a blast of cold so sharp it cut through wool and denim, and there, on the porch, half lost in blowing snow, stood a German shepherd. Female, large even by breed standards, her black and tan coat buried under a crust of ice. Thick fur stiffened into jagged ridges, long, translucent icicles hanging from her swollen belly and tail, each breath leaving her in shallow, visible clouds. She was heavily pregnant, her abdomen round and taut, the weight pulling low between her hind legs, her ribs faintly visible beneath winter fur that should have been glossy but now lay matted and dull, and around her neck a pale indentation marked where a collar or chain had once pressed too long against skin. Her ears remained upright, though the tips trembled. Amber eyes fixed not in aggression but in exhausted resolve, and though her legs shook from cold and strain, she did not whine, did not bark, did not attempt to cross the threshold uninvited. She simply stood waiting, as if some instinct older than pain had guided her to this precise door. Samuel felt a tightening behind his ribs that surprised him in its immediacy. Not pity exactly, but recognition. An understanding of endurance carried too far alone. And instead of speaking, he stepped back from the doorway and lowered his gaze slightly, hands open at his sides, offering space rather than command, the silent language he trusted more than reassurance. For a moment the storm pressed between them, snow swirling into the cabin before melting on the wooden floor, and he found himself aware of the strange fragility of the scene, of how easily he could close the door and return to the life he had perfected in solitude. How safe it would be to pretend he had heard nothing at all. Yet he did not move. The dog shifted her weight, exhaled in a long shudder that seemed to empty what remained of her strength, and then with painful deliberation lifted one paw, then another, stepping across the threshold into warmth without breaking eye contact. The sound of her nails against the floorboards was faint but final, and as Samuel closed the door behind her, the wind cut off abruptly, leaving only the crackle of the stove and the uneven rhythm of her breathing filling the room. She stood just inside, body rigid despite exhaustion, snow sliding in clumps from her flanks, and Samuel crouched several feet away, not touching, not crowding, studying the tremor in her hind legs, the stiffness along her spine, the way she held her head slightly lowered yet unbowed, and he saw in her not weakness but stubborn will, the same kind that had kept him moving across terrain that should have stopped him years ago. After a few suspended seconds, she turned her head toward the stove, the glow reflecting in her eyes, and with a slow, careful motion that suggested both pain and relief, she lowered herself onto the braided rug near the heat, the descent awkward because of the heavy swell of her belly, until finally she lay on her side and released a long breath that seemed almost like surrender. Samuel rose and retrieved a thick wool blanket from the back of a wooden chair, one Eleanor had once insisted they keep near the fire for guests who might arrive unannounced, and he paused only briefly before draping it gently over the dog's back, careful not to startle her. She flinched at first contact but did not snap or recoil, merely watched him with guarded calculation that slowly softened into wary acceptance. Outside, down the slope beyond the trees, Margaret Collins sat alone at her kitchen table in a narrow white farmhouse that had belonged to her family for 42 years, a small, thin woman of 74 with pale skin, finely lined by both sun and sorrow, silver hair braided neatly down her back, posture slightly stooped yet dignified. Her children had called that morning to confirm arrangements for her move to a retirement facility in Asheville, speaking gently but firmly, and she had agreed in a voice that sounded obedient even to her own ears, though inside she felt as if she were being folded away like unused linen. As the storm rattled her windows, she stared at the packed cardboard boxes lining her hallway and wondered when exactly her life had shifted from being needed to being managed, and an unexpected ache rose in her chest that she could not quite name. Back in the cabin, Samuel settled onto the floor with his back against the wall, boots still on, hands resting loosely on his knees, watching the dog's breathing gradually deepen as warmth seeped into frozen muscle. He noticed the fine scar across her muzzle, the split nail on her left hind paw, the faint shiver that passed through her abdomen as the pups within shifted, and he felt something within himself answer that movement, not as memory of loss, but as a quiet stirring of responsibility he had avoided for years. He did not know where she had come from or who had failed her, but as the fire crackled and the storm continued its assault outside, he understood with unsettling clarity that the silence he had guarded so carefully had just been broken, and that for the first time since Eleanor's death, the cabin held another heartbeat besides his own, fragile yet persistent. And when the dog's head finally lowered fully to the rug and her eyes closed in exhausted trust, Samuel Hayes remained where he was, listening to the shared rhythm of breath in the room, and realizing that the storm had delivered more than snow to his door. The storm did not break when morning came, but it softened, the wind easing into a steady drift that laid fresh snow over the porch in careful layers, and inside the cedar cabin the air carried the scent of damp wool, wood smoke, and something fragile but alive. Samuel Hayes woke stiff against the wall where he had remained through the night, not truly asleep, but suspended in a half-rest that old soldiers learned to accept. And for a moment he listened before opening his eyes, measuring the room by sound. The dog's breathing, though still heavy, had steadied into a deeper rhythm, punctuated by faint shifts as the unborn pups pressed within her. In the clearer light he could see the damage more plainly. Patches where fur had frozen into coarse spikes now thawed into clumped strands, a raw, chafed circle around her neck where a chain had likely rubbed for months, the left hind paw swollen slightly at the joint, one nail cracked to the quick, and despite the heavy pregnancy her hips stood too sharp beneath her coat. He moved carefully, filling a basin with lukewarm water and kneeling several feet away before sliding it closer, allowing her to watch each motion. She lifted her head, amber eyes wary but no longer distant, and when he dipped a cloth and reached toward her flank she flinched once, then held still, muscles tight with the expectation of pain rather than kindness. Samuel worked in small sections, pressing warmth into frozen fur, melting the last stubborn ridges of ice along her belly, where icicles had clung like glass daggers, and he found himself murmuring without realizing it. low, steady phrases that had once soothed frightened recruits, and later, in gentler years, his wife Eleanor when illness hollowed her strength. The memory rose unbidden, but did not wound him as sharply this time, instead settling beside him like an old photograph taken down from a shelf. When the worst of the ice was gone, he wrapped her again in the thick wool blanket and rose to retrieve the landline phone mounted near the kitchen doorway, hesitating only briefly before dialing the number of Dr. Emily Carter, the town's veterinarian, whose card he kept taped inside a cupboard, though he had not owned an animal since Eleanor's passing. Emily answered on the third ring, her voice brisk but not unkind. At 39, she carried the contained confidence of someone accustomed to decisions that could not wait. Medium height with an athletic build shaped by years of lifting anxious animals onto metal tables, chestnut hair usually tied back into a low, practical knot, pale, freckled skin, and intelligent hazel eyes that missed little, and a small crescent scar near her right eyebrow from a childhood fall off a horse that she once told Samuel had taught her patience more effectively than any lecture. She asked precise questions: breathing rate, gum color, responsiveness, signs of discharge, and Samuel answered with clipped clarity, describing what he observed rather than what he feared, and after a pause, she said she would come as soon as the road allowed, adding quietly that, given the stage of pregnancy, the dog was likely within 48 hours of labor. By late morning, her truck crunched into the clearing, tires cutting fresh tracks across unmarked snow, and Emily entered without ceremony, boots dusted white, a thick parka zipped to her chin, carrying a worn black medical case that looked older than she was. She knelt near the dog but did not touch immediately, offering the back of her hand to be sniffed, waiting for consent the way she always did. And when the shepherd allowed it, she began her examination with practiced efficiency, checking temperature, hydration, palpating the abdomen with firm yet careful pressure. Her mouth tightened at the collar mark, and she traced it lightly with her fingertip, before glancing up at Samuel with an expression that mixed professionalism and restrained anger. "She's underweight for this stage," Emily said evenly. "Dehydrated, and she's been restrained too tightly for a long time. This isn't recent neglect." She explained that stress and malnutrition could complicate the birth, but added that the dog's heart rate remained strong and the pup's movements felt responsive. Then outlined what must follow: small, frequent feedings, fresh water within reach, minimal disturbance, and above all, calm. Samuel listened as if receiving mission instructions, committing each detail to memory, and when Emily packed her instruments, she paused, studying him with a softer look. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, not as pressure but acknowledgement. And he answered simply that he wasn't sure he was alone anymore. After she left, the cabin seemed to settle around the quiet of her departure, and by mid-afternoon, a cautious knock sounded at the door. Margaret Collins stood there wrapped in a long navy coat that hung loosely on her narrow frame, silver braid resting over one shoulder, cheeks pink from cold, hands gloved but trembling slightly from more than temperature. She held a thermos and a covered bowl, and when Samuel stepped aside, she entered with the careful politeness of someone accustomed to not intruding, her pale blue eyes widening at the sight of the large shepherd resting near the stove. Margaret moved closer slowly, bending with visible stiffness at the waist, and studied the animal's swollen belly and weary gaze. For a moment, her lined face softened into something like recognition. "I suppose," she said quietly, setting the soup on the table, "that the Lord doesn't misplace deliveries." Samuel did not smile broadly, but the corner of his mouth shifted in acknowledgement, and as Margaret poured soup into two mismatched bowls, she spoke of the retirement home again, of how her children believed it safer, how the idea of leaving the farmhouse where she had raised 3 sons felt less like transition and more like erasure. Her voice did not tremble, yet beneath its steadiness lay the grief of someone being gently set aside. The dog lifted her head at Margaret's voice but did not growl, watching with alert curiosity. And when Margaret knelt and extended her hand, palm up, the shepherd sniffed and then rested her chin briefly against the older woman's knuckles, a small gesture that seemed to undo something tight inside Margaret's chest. "See?" she whispered, more to herself than to Samuel. "Not every ending is an ending." Evening gathered slowly. The storm reduced now to drifting flurries that brushed the windows in softer patterns. And after Margaret departed, Samuel returned to the floor beside the stove, adjusting the blanket when the dog shifted restlessly, offering water that she drank in cautious intervals. He noticed the subtle changes Emily had warned about, an increased tension along the abdomen, brief ripples beneath fur as the pups repositioned. And though apprehension stirred within him, he did not retreat from it. Instead, he allowed his thoughts to travel where they had long refused to go, recalling Eleanor's final weeks not as sterile hospital memory but as shared mornings of quiet bravery, the way she had squeezed his hand and told him that strength was not measured by what one endured alone, but by what one chose to hold. The shepherd exhaled and lowered her head again, eyes half closed, and Samuel found himself speaking into the dim room, not to the dog alone, but to the echo of the woman he had loved, admitting that perhaps solitude had been less about protection and more about fear. As night deepened, he remained on the floor, back against the wall, boots unlaced this time, hands resting open, listening to the steady crackle of fire and the breathing that now matched his own in rhythm, and for the first time in years he did not push memory away. He let it sit beside him like another presence in the room, neither enemy nor ghost. And outside, the storm moved farther down the mountain while inside the cabin held its fragile warmth, waiting. The third night after the storm settled over, Boone arrived without drama, the sky clearing into a brittle sweep of stars while cold pressed quietly against the cabin walls, and inside the cedar room the air felt charged with a tension too subtle to name yet impossible to ignore. Samuel Hayes sensed the shift before he saw it, a tightening in the rhythm of the German shepherd's breathing, a deliberate stillness that replaced the restless adjustments of the past day, and he moved from the kitchen table to the floor near the stove without hurry, lowering himself with careful control as if entering a space where sudden motion would break something sacred. The dog lay on her side, flanks rising unevenly, amber eyes no longer clouded by exhaustion alone but sharpened by instinct, and when a ripple passed through her abdomen, visible beneath the thick fur that had finally dried into its natural black and tan bands, Samuel understood that waiting had ended and effort had begun. He had followed Dr. Emily Carter's instructions with disciplined precision. Clean towels, warmed but not hot, fresh water within reach, lights kept low. And now he resisted every urge to intervene, recalling her steady voice reminding him that nature often required presence more than assistance. The first contraction tightened her body from shoulders to hips, and though she did not cry out, a low sound vibrated deep in her chest, not of fear but of strain, and Samuel felt his own breath lock in sympathy. He remained where he was, hands open on his knees, gray-blue eyes attentive yet deliberately calm. The old soldier in him recognizing that some battles demanded endurance rather than strategy. Across the slope in her farmhouse, Margaret Collins sat upright in her narrow bed, hands folded over the quilt she had not yet packed, unable to sleep though the wind had stilled, and she could not have explained why unease pulsed beneath her ribs, only that it felt like waiting at the edge of news not yet spoken. At 74, her body had grown slight and easily chilled, but her spirit, though bruised by recent decisions about leaving her home, remained quietly resilient, and she found herself whispering prayers into the dark, not polished or rehearsed, simply small requests for mercy for reasons she did not fully understand. Back in the cabin, the shepherd shifted, attempting to rise before another contraction bent her down again, and Samuel noticed how she repositioned herself with deliberate care, circling once despite the weight of her swollen belly, then lowering onto the nest of towels he had arranged earlier. Sweat dampened the fur along her neck despite the cool room, and her breath came in measured bursts that echoed faintly off the wooden walls. When the first small form emerged, slick and dark against the white towel, time seemed to narrow into a single fragile thread, and for a suspended heartbeat the newborn lay motionless, its tiny body limp in the dim firelight. Samuel's muscles tensed with reflexive urgency, yet he did not move. Holding himself back with an effort greater than any he had known in combat, trusting the mother before him to know what to do. The shepherd turned with sudden focus, licking vigorously, nudging the pup with firm precision, and Samuel counted silently, each second stretching into doubt until, at last, a faint flutter shivered through the tiny chest and a thin, wavering gasp cut the silence. The sound was small, almost lost beneath the crackle of the stove, but it landed in Samuel like thunder, and he exhaled with a tremor he did not attempt to hide. The second pup followed sooner, lighter in color with a faint pale streak across its chest, wriggling with indignant determination as if protesting the cold, and Samuel felt an unexpected laugh rise in his throat, rough but genuine, a sound unused for too long. The third arrived after a pause that tested patience again, darker than the others with a distinct black mask marking its face. Its first movement a slow stretching of tiny limbs that seemed almost contemplative. 3 small lives pressed now against their mother's side, searching instinctively for warmth, and the shepherd, still unnamed until that moment, lowered her head to inspect each in turn, her earlier wariness replaced by an expression Samuel could only interpret as fierce devotion. He felt tears gather unannounced, warm against weathered skin, and did not wipe them away. He had wept before in hospital corridors and at gravesides, but this felt different, less like loss and more like release, as if something frozen within him had thawed alongside the dog's fur days earlier. He glanced toward the shelf where a framed photograph of Eleanor rested, her auburn hair loose around smiling shoulders, and for the first time the sight did not hollow him but steadied him, and he murmured into the dim light, "You'd have liked this," before returning his gaze to the living scene before him. Outside, Margaret rose from her bed and moved to the window, wrapping a shawl around her thin shoulders, sensing without evidence that somewhere beyond the trees something had shifted, and she bowed her head once more, whispering gratitude into the quiet night air. In the cabin, Samuel reached for a clean cloth and gently adjusted the blanket around the exhausted mother, careful not to intrude on her work, and when she lifted her gaze to meet his, amber eyes clear despite fatigue, he felt the word form without deliberation. "Hope," he said softly, testing the sound in the warmth of the room, and the name settled as naturally as breath. The dog's ears flicked at the tone, and she rested her head back down among the pups, accepting both the warmth and the word without resistance. Hours passed unmeasured, the fire burning low, the newborn's tiny squeaks weaving into the steady rhythm of nursing, and Samuel remained seated on the floor, back against the wall, posture upright yet unguarded, watching life anchor itself in the most ordinary of spaces. He understood with quiet clarity that he had not been summoned to rescue, but to witness, that the strength he once used to shield others from gunfire now served a gentler purpose, and when he finally leaned forward slightly, hands clasped loosely together, he whispered into the shared warmth of the cabin, "Thank you for choosing this house," his voice steady though thick with emotion. Morning arrived clear and brittle over Boone, sunlight striking the snow with a brightness that felt almost merciless after the tenderness of the night before, and inside the cedar cabin the air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke and warm milk as the 3 newborn pups pressed close against Hope's side, their small bodies rising and falling in fragile synchronization. Samuel Hayes stood at the window with a mug cooling in his hand, watching the valley emerge from winter's hush, aware that the quiet he had guarded for years had already shifted into something more exposed, more visible. Hope lay curled protectively around her pups, amber eyes tracking his movements but no longer guarded, and when a truck engine growled up the narrow road mid-morning, she lifted her head, ears angling forward with a low, warning rumble deep in her chest. The vehicle that pulled into the clearing was a late-model pickup, polished despite the season, its tires cutting hard lines through the snow. The man who stepped out carried himself with an affected ease that did not match the tightness around his mouth. Rick Dawson was in his mid-40s, average height but thick through the shoulders in a way that suggested strength once used more for intimidation than labor, light brown hair combed back too carefully, a short, uneven beard shadowing a jaw that seemed perpetually clenched. His eyes were pale and restless, scanning before settling, and when he approached the porch his smile arrived a fraction too late to be natural. Samuel opened the door but did not step aside. Rick introduced himself smoothly, claiming the German shepherd as his, explaining she had wandered off weeks ago during the storm, his tone casual, yet edged with impatience. And as he spoke, Samuel noticed the faint smell of stale tobacco clinging to his jacket, and the way his gaze flicked past Samuel toward the interior rather than resting on the man he addressed. Hope's growl deepened at the sound of his voice, Not loud, but unmistakable, her body tightening around the pups, and Samuel felt a steadiness settle over him that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. He asked for proof, vaccination records, registration, any documentation at all, and Rick's answers circled rather than landed, excuses delivered with practiced charm that thinned when pressed. The pale mark around Hope's neck seemed suddenly brighter in the morning light, and Samuel thought of Emily Carter's measured anger the day before. By early afternoon, Dr. Emily Carter returned, summoned by a brief call, her expression sharpening the moment she saw Rick standing rigid near the porch rail. She positioned herself slightly between the man and the doorway, not confrontational, but firm, hazel eyes steady as she repeated her earlier findings about prolonged restraint and malnourishment. Rick's jaw worked, and he shrugged in a gesture meant to convey innocence, claiming the dog was difficult, that she needed firm handling, that accidents happened. The words landed flat in the cold air. Deputy Tom Reeves arrived shortly after, responding to Emily's quiet call, his patrol SUV crunching into the drive. Tom was 52, tall and broad, with a naturally imposing frame softened only by calm gray eyes, his beard trimmed close and peppered with silver. A man shaped by decades of small-town law enforcement where listening often prevented escalation. He had known Samuel by reputation, respected him without familiarity, and he regarded Rick with the balanced neutrality of someone accustomed to sorting truth from performance. As Tom took notes, asking for identification and ownership records, Rick's composure thinned further, irritation bleeding into his tone. He spoke of property rights and misunderstandings, but when pressed for documentation he could produce nothing beyond vague assurances. Inside the cabin, Hope remained tense yet silent, her body a barrier around her pups, and the sight of her posture seemed to speak more loudly than any accusation. Down the slope, Margaret Collins watched the gathering from her porch, anxiety tightening her chest, and after a moment of hesitation that surprised even her, she wrapped her coat more tightly around her thin shoulders and made her way up the path, boots sinking into snow with determined steps. Margaret had rarely inserted herself into public disputes, her life defined by quiet endurance rather than confrontation, but something in Rick's raised voice stirred a firmness she had not felt in years. When she reached the porch, she stood beside Samuel without looking at him for reassurance. Pale blue eyes fixed on the deputy as she spoke in a clear, steady tone about what she had witnessed since the storm, about the condition of the dog, about the gentleness she had seen replace fear inside that cabin. Her voice did not tremble, and though she was slight in stature, there was an authority in her conviction that shifted the atmosphere. Deputy Reeves listened carefully, weighing not only the absence of paperwork, but the visible evidence of neglect, and after a measured pause, he informed Rick that the matter would require formal review through county animal control and that, pending investigation, the dog would remain under temporary protective custody. Rick's shoulders stiffened, his smile gone entirely now, and for a long moment it seemed he might argue further. Instead, he exhaled sharply, muttered something under his breath, and turned back toward his truck, the engine's growl harsher than before as he drove away without another word. The clearing fell quiet again, though not as it had been. The silence now carried a shared awareness of what had nearly been reclaimed and what had been defended. Inside, Hope's growl subsided into a low huff as she settled back against her pups, tension easing from her spine, and Samuel knelt a short distance away, hands resting open against his thighs, meeting her gaze with quiet reassurance. Margaret lingered at the threshold, cheeks flushed from cold and adrenaline, and for the first time in years she felt not diminished by age, but strengthened by purpose. Deputy Reeves removed his hat briefly before leaving, offering Samuel a look that conveyed both caution and support, promising follow-up once documentation was reviewed. As the vehicles disappeared down the road, Samuel closed the door gently and returned to the stove, adjusting the blanket around Hope and the 3 small lives nestled against her warmth. Understanding that the fight had not been loud or dramatic yet, had carried weight nonetheless. He did not feel triumph, only alignment, as if something fragile had been shielded long enough to grow stronger, and when Hope lifted her head and studied him with those steady amber eyes, he sensed a trust deepening, Not claimed, but earned. The days that followed Rick Dawson's departure unfolded beneath a sky scrubbed clean by cold, sunlight glinting off the snow in wide sheets of silver, and the cabin at the end of the ridge no longer felt hidden from the world but quietly visible, as though something within its walls had sent a signal outward without meaning to. Samuel Hayes noticed the change first in small sounds, the crunch of tires on packed snow where none had traveled before, the careful knock of knuckles against wood that carried hesitation but not fear. And each time he opened the door he found someone standing on the porch with something held between both hands, as if offering more than a simple object. The first was Helen Porter, a slight woman in her early 80s whose spine had curved gently with age, yet whose dark eyes remained sharp and lively. Her white hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and she wore a long wool coat the color of faded cranberry that hung loosely over her narrow shoulders. Helen had been a schoolteacher for nearly 40 years and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to guiding children through uncertainty, and in her arms she held a folded quilt stitched from scraps of flannel and denim. "For the little ones," she said softly, stepping inside only when invited, her gaze warming at the sight of Hope curled around the pups near the stove. She did not linger, but before leaving she pressed Samuel's arm lightly and added, "It's good to see that place lit up again." By afternoon, another visitor arrived, this time a tall, broad-shouldered man named Carl Bennett, 59, with wind-chapped skin and a thick gray mustache that framed a mouth more used to silence than conversation. Carl had worked the nearby sawmill until it closed the previous year, an event that had left him slower to trust and wary of dependency, and he carried 2 large bags of high-quality dog feed over each shoulder as though compensating for words he found difficult. He nodded once toward Samuel and glanced briefly at the pups, clearing his throat before muttering, "Figured you could use it," then retreating without waiting for thanks. Inside the cabin, Hope's demeanor shifted subtly with each arrival. She remained protective, yet no longer defensive, watching from her nest with amber eyes that tracked movement but did not narrow, and Samuel noticed how the pups stirred at new voices, small bodies stretching instinctively toward warmth and sound. Over the next days the pattern continued, jars of homemade soup left at the doorstep, bundles of clean towels, small envelopes with handwritten notes offering assistance. And Samuel found himself moving through the cabin not as a solitary occupant but as a host, clearing space at the table, arranging items neatly along shelves, keeping careful track of what arrived. It was Margaret Collins who suggested the ledger, appearing one morning with a leather-bound notebook tucked beneath her arm, cheeks flushed with purpose rather than cold. She stood straighter than Samuel had ever seen her, silver braid pinned higher as if to clear her vision, and announced in a tone that brooked no argument that supplies should be recorded and accounted for. "Kindness deserves order," she said simply, settling into a chair at the kitchen table with pen poised. As she wrote names and items in precise, looping script, her pale face brightened with concentration, and she spoke of calling her daughter to delay the retirement home arrangements, explaining that she needed time, that she had responsibilities here now. There was a firmness in her voice that surprised even her, a reclaiming of agency she had not realized she missed. Samuel watched her from across the room, recognizing in her transformation something mirrored in himself, and, for the first time since Eleanor's passing, the cabin echoed not with silence but with conversation that felt neither intrusive nor fragile. One afternoon, a younger woman named Sarah Delgado arrived, early 40s, tall and slender with dark chestnut hair falling loose around olive-toned skin, her posture upright despite the fatigue in her eyes. She managed the small grocery store in town and had lost her husband to a sudden heart condition 3 years prior, an event that had carved resilience into her features without hardening her kindness. Sarah carried a crate of canned goods and paused at the threshold, absorbing the sight of Hope and the pups with quiet awe before offering a tentative smile. "People are talking," she said gently, "about how that dog chose your place." And though she meant it lightly, the words seemed to ripple through the room. Hope's ears flicked at the unfamiliar voice, but she did not rise, instead lowering her head again in acceptance, and Sarah crouched briefly to observe the pups before standing, brushing snow from her coat and promising to spread word of any further needs. With each passing day, the cabin felt less like a refuge against the world and more like a point of intersection, where grief and generosity met without spectacle. Samuel found himself cooking larger meals, setting out extra chairs, and even laughing once when one of the pups attempted to climb over its siblings, only to tumble sideways in exaggerated indignation. Margaret's ledger thickened with entries, her handwriting steady, and she began arriving earlier each morning, bringing tea and suggestions about organizing the porch to receive donations more efficiently. She spoke of repainting the mailbox in spring, of clearing a path down the slope so older neighbors could walk up more easily, and when Samuel asked lightly whether she still intended to leave for Asheville, she met his gaze without hesitation and said, "No, I believe I've somewhere else to be." Word traveled not through announcements but through pauses in conversation at church, in the hardware store, at the post office, until one evening Samuel overheard Carl referring to the cabin as "that house on the hill," a phrase that carried no mockery, only recognition. The name took hold quietly, repeated by Helen, by Sarah, by others who climbed the narrow road with offerings held carefully in gloved hands, and Samuel felt it settle into place without ceremony. Hope shifted closer to the stove, her coat regaining luster as nourishment replaced depletion, and the pups grew visibly stronger, their movements more coordinated, their small squeaks now insistent declarations of life. Standing at the window at dusk, watching another pair of headlights wind down the ridge after a brief visit, Samuel understood that the cabin had crossed an unseen threshold. It no longer belonged solely to the memory of what he had lost, but to the living network forming around it. When Margaret closed her ledger for the evening and smiled toward the nest by the fire, she said softly, "It's not just your place anymore, Samuel." And he did not argue, because outside, beneath the fading light, the town had already begun calling it the house on the hill. Spring did not arrive in Boone with fanfare, but with hesitation, as though winter were reluctant to loosen its grip on the Blue Ridge slopes, and the snow retreated in uneven patches that revealed damp earth beneath, dark and patient. The cabin on the hill stood between seasons, its porch still rimmed with frost in the mornings while thin threads of green pressed upward along the south-facing bank, and inside the air felt different, lighter somehow, no longer heavy with vigilance but with movement. Hope lay stretched near the open door where fresh air carried the scent of thawing soil, her coat restored to a rich gloss of black and tan that caught the light in healthy bands, the pale mark around her neck still visible yet no longer defining her. She had regained weight steadily under careful feeding, muscle filling out along her flanks, and when she rose her movements were confident rather than cautious. The 3 pups had transformed from fragile bundles into determined little bodies that tumbled across the braided rug in exaggerated play, their eyes bright with curiosity. The firstborn, whom Samuel privately called Ranger before he knew whether the name would remain, carried himself with bold forward motion, a faint, pale streak on his chest like a small badge, forever pressing toward whatever new object appeared. The second, lighter in color with softer features, responded first to sound, head tilting earnestly at the smallest whistle, her temperament inclined toward gentleness. Samuel had begun thinking of her as Lily. The third, darker, with a thoughtful black mask framing steady eyes, preferred observation before action, sitting back as siblings explored, then moving with deliberate purpose once certain. He had taken to calling him Shadow. Samuel did not announce the names aloud at first, aware that attachment should not outrun circumstance, yet he found himself using them in quiet tones when alone, testing how they felt in the room. Official paperwork progressed more smoothly than he had expected. Deputy Tom Reeves had followed through with county animal control, and after review of Rick Dawson's lack of documentation and Emily Carter's veterinary assessment, Samuel was granted temporary guardianship with the option to formalize adoption. The day he drove into town to sign the final documents, he wore the same dark flannel shirt he had worn for years, his silver hair combed back with practical care, jaw clean-shaven, posture straight, not from pride, but habit. At the county office he signed with steady hand, feeling not triumph but completion, as though a quiet responsibility had simply found its rightful place. Emily met him outside afterward. her chestnut hair loose in the mild breeze, hazel eyes bright with approval, and clasped his forearm briefly before saying, "She chose well." A statement delivered not lightly, but with conviction. Back at the cabin, Margaret Collins had begun transforming afternoons into something she called tea hour, though it was less about porcelain cups and more about presents. She rearranged the small kitchen table, adding 2 borrowed folding chairs and a lace cloth salvaged from her cedar chest, and invited a handful of women from church, widows mostly, women who had learned to move quietly through rooms that once echoed with shared voices. Among them was Ruth Henderson, a tall, spare woman in her late 70s with pale, translucent skin and wisps of fine white hair escaping from a loose bun, whose husband's long illness had carved both patience and loneliness into her posture. And Elaine Morris, shorter and sturdier, with carefully set curls tinted faint lavender and a laugh that came unexpectedly loud after long stretches of silence, having lost her son years ago in an accident that had closed parts of her off from the world. They sat around the table sipping tea from mismatched mugs, while the pups investigated shoelaces and hems, and Margaret presided not as hostess, but as facilitator, her once hesitant voice now steady as she encouraged conversation about memory without letting it drift into despair. Samuel kept mostly to the edges during these gatherings, repairing a loose porch board or splitting kindling within earshot, yet he listened as stories unfolded, of marriages that had lasted half a century, of recipes no one else remembered, of the strange emptiness that followed funerals once casseroles stopped arriving. Hope moved calmly among them, greeting each woman with measured gentleness, allowing careful hands to rest against her flank, her demeanor conveying authority without dominance. Even Ranger's bold advances softened under her quiet correction, and Lily often curled at the feet of whoever seemed most fragile that afternoon. The rhythm of these meetings became predictable in the best way, and Samuel observed how Margaret's back straightened each time she poured tea, how purpose replaced resignation in the lines of her face. One morning, she arrived early, breathless, not from exertion, but excitement, announcing that she had formally declined the retirement home placement and informed her children she would remain in Boone. There was tremor in her hands as she spoke, but it was the tremor of reclaimed choice rather than fear. "I'm needed here," she said simply, glancing toward Hope and the pups, and Samuel felt an answering warmth in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. The cabin itself seemed to adjust to this new season. Windows were opened for the first time in months, curtains drawn back to admit longer light, and the porch, cleared of snow, revealed weathered boards ready for sanding once true warmth settled in. The pups began venturing onto the grass as it emerged, their paws tentative at first on soft ground rather than packed snow, and Samuel found himself crouched nearby offering guidance with a whistle or low command, rediscovering instincts he had once used to train working dogs years ago during service, though now without urgency or danger attached. In quiet moments he stood at the doorway watching Hope stretch in the mild sun, her head lifted, eyes half closed in contentment, and he realized that recovery was not dramatic but incremental, built from consistent care rather than singular rescue. Tea hour expanded slightly as word spread, though Margaret kept it intimate by design, insisting that conversation mattered more than numbers, and Sarah Delgado began dropping off fresh bread from the grocery store, lingering long enough to exchange brief laughter with Elaine or Ruth before returning to town. The cabin, once a structure built for isolation, now held layers of voices that did not compete but braided together, and Samuel noticed that he no longer counted the hours until nightfall. Instead, he measured days by the growth of the pups, the entries in Margaret's ledger, the soft murmur of women who refused to vanish quietly. One late afternoon, as sunlight filtered gold through budding branches, and Hope rested near the steps while the pups chased a drifting leaf, Samuel leaned against the porch rail and understood with clarity that the cabin's purpose had shifted. It no longer stood merely as shelter from wind and snow, but as a space where grief could sit down without being asked to leave. He did not speak the realization aloud, but when Margaret stepped beside him and followed his gaze across the yard, she nodded once, as if she sensed it too, and the house on the hill held more than warmth. It held hearts learning how to remain open. By the time true spring settled across Boone, The grass along the slope below the cabin had thickened into a deep green, and the air carried the layered scents of pine sap, damp earth, and something faintly sweet from wildflowers pushing through last season's leaves. The house on the hill no longer stood apart from town life, but had become threaded into it, and Samuel Hayes felt the shift not as disruption, but as steady expansion. Hope moved through the yard with calm assurance, her coat gleaming under longer daylight, her body strong and balanced, and the three pups, Ranger bold and forward, Lily gentle and responsive, Shadow thoughtful and watchful, had grown into lanky adolescents testing boundaries with playful intensity. It began quietly, as most lasting changes did. Sarah Delgado arrived one afternoon not only with bread, but with a question. Her tall frame framed by sunlight, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, olive-toned skin warmed by the season. She explained that a family on the edge of town was facing eviction after medical bills overwhelmed them, and their aging beagle, 12-year-old Molly, had nowhere to stay temporarily. Sarah's voice carried the tempered strength of someone who had rebuilt life after sudden loss, and when she asked whether Samuel might consider short-term care, she did so without expectation of praise, only practical concern. Samuel listened, gray-blue eyes steady, and answered that he would not take payment but would require clear understanding of duration and responsibility. Transparency, he had learned, prevented both resentment and confusion. Molly arrived the next morning, led by her owner, a thin man named Peter Lawson in his early 40s, whose once athletic build had hollowed under stress. His sandy hair was cropped unevenly, as if cut without care, and his hands trembled slightly when he unclipped the leash, revealing eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. He explained in halting sentences that his wife's surgery had left them financially strained, that he would find work soon, that Molly was gentle but slow now, and as he knelt to press his forehead briefly against the dog's, Samuel recognized in him the quiet humiliation of asking for help. Molly herself was small and round, with a soft tricolor coat graying at the muzzle, cloudy eyes that hinted at diminished sight yet a tail that wagged persistently. Hope approached her with measured authority, sniffing once before stepping aside, granting entry without challenge. Samuel noted the interaction carefully, observing that Ranger's boldness softened near the older dog, while Lily instinctively lay down beside her, and Shadow circled at a distance, assessing before settling. Word spread that the house on the hill would provide temporary refuge without charge, and Samuel made it clear that he accepted no money, only written agreements and honest timelines. Margaret insisted on adding a new section to her ledger labeled Guests, recording dates, names, and conditions with the meticulous care of a librarian cataloging rare books. It was during this early phase that a teenage boy began appearing at the edge of the property, hovering uncertainly near the gate. His name was Ethan Brooks, 16, tall for his age, but narrow-shouldered, dark hair falling into eyes that rarely met another's directly. Freckles dotted his pale skin, and there was a guarded tension in the way he carried himself, as if bracing for criticism before it arrived. Ethan had lost his older brother in a car accident 2 years prior, an event that fractured his family's equilibrium and left him drifting between anger and invisibility, skipping classes and spending long hours alone by the riverbank. One afternoon, Samuel called out to him not with reprimand but invitation, asking whether he might help repair a loose fence board. The request was deliberate, framed as necessity rather than charity. Ethan hesitated, then stepped forward, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn hoodie, and worked in silence at first, but he returned the next day and the next, gradually accepting small tasks, cleaning water bowls, brushing Molly's thinning coat, guiding the pups through basic commands under Samuel's watchful instruction. Samuel recognized in the boy the restless vigilance he had once carried himself, the sense of existing on the perimeter of one's own life, and he spoke sparingly but directly, correcting mistakes without belittling, praising effort without exaggeration. Ethan responded to that steadiness. His shoulders eased, eye contact strengthened, and when Ranger mastered a recall command under Ethan's guidance, the flicker of pride that crossed the boy's face felt earned rather than accidental. Meanwhile, others arrived with temporary needs. A young couple relocating for seasonal work, entrusted a skittish tabby cat named Jasper for 2 weeks, small, silver-striped, barely a year old, whose green eyes darted constantly until Lily's quiet presence calmed him, and an elderly farmer recovering from hip surgery left behind his stoic border collie, Duke, a 5-year-old black and white working dog whose posture remained upright even at rest, his loyalty evident in the way he tracked every movement in the yard. Each new arrival required integration, and Samuel approached the process with disciplined patience, introducing animals gradually, observing Hope's signals as primary guide, maintaining structure without harshness. Margaret's tea gatherings continued, sometimes expanding to include conversations about caregiving and endurance, and she often watched Ethan through the window, remarking softly that purpose could grow in unlikely soil. Deputy Tom Reeves stopped by periodically, not to monitor, but to ensure procedures remained lawful, and his approval of Samuel's careful documentation reinforced the legitimacy of what was forming. The yard, once empty save for wind, now held layered activity. Dogs stretching in sun, Ethan laughing unexpectedly when Shadow tumbled into a shallow stream, Molly sleeping peacefully under the porch rail, Jasper sunning himself safely out of reach. Samuel stood at the edge of the slope one evening, observing the quiet choreography of lives intersecting under his watch, and he felt a recognition deeper than satisfaction. He had not merely sheltered animals, but created a space where dignity could be preserved during hardship. Hope settled beside him, pressing her flank lightly against his leg, amber eyes surveying the yard with calm confidence, and he understood that what had begun as a single act of compassion had widened into something communal. He did not speak the realization aloud, but as Ethan waved goodnight with unguarded ease, and Margaret closed her ledger for the day, Samuel grasped that he was not rescuing creatures alone. He was helping mend fractures in people who needed a place to pause without shame. By early summer, the ridge above Boone shimmered under a gentler sun, the long grasses bending in warm currents of air, and the house on the hill felt less like a refuge from winter and more like a place rooted in open light. Hope moved with quiet authority through the yard, her strength complete now, coat thick and gleaming, while Ranger, Lily, and Shadow had grown into strong young dogs with distinct temperaments that no longer required close guarding but careful guidance. Samuel Hayes had begun the deliberate process of finding permanent homes for 2 of the pups, not hurriedly and not sentimentally, but with the same measured attention he applied to everything that mattered. He insisted on meeting potential families in person, observing posture, tone, the way hands reached toward the animals, searching not for perfection but for steadiness. The first to adopt was the Whitaker family from the lower valley, led by Thomas Whitaker, a tall man in his mid-30s with broad shoulders and a weathered face shaped by long hours repairing farm equipment, his sandy beard trimmed close and his handshake firm without aggression. Beside him stood his wife Claire, slight and soft-spoken, chestnut hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat, her pale skin freckled from sun, and between them their 8-year-old daughter Hannah, whose cautious gentleness toward Lily spoke more clearly than any assurances. Samuel watched how Lily responded to the child's voice, how she leaned into Hannah's careful touch without fear, and he felt the alignment settle into place. The second adoption followed a week later when Dr. Emily Carter introduced her cousin, Daniel Moore, a high school literature teacher newly transferred to Boone. Early 40s with kind brown eyes behind thin-framed glasses, dark hair flecked prematurely with gray, his lean build and thoughtful demeanor reflecting a life shaped more by books than by physical labor. Daniel had lost his longtime companion, an aging Labrador, the previous winter, and there remained in his posture a quiet ache that Ranger seemed instinctively drawn to. Ranger, bold and forward, approached him without hesitation, tail high, and when Daniel knelt and laughed openly as the pup pressed against him, Samuel recognized in the man a readiness for companionship that did not depend on filling a void, but on honoring it. The day both pups left the ridge, Hope watched from the porch without distress, her ears upright, body relaxed, yet attentive, and Samuel felt the bittersweet weight of transition settle in his chest. He did not mistake release for loss, understanding that letting go was not abandonment but trust extended outward. Within days, the first letter arrived, delivered by hand through Sarah Delgado, who smiled as she placed the envelope on the kitchen table. It bore Hannah's careful looping handwriting and contained a drawing of Lily curled beneath a farmhouse window, along with simple words of gratitude for the bravest dog ever. Samuel read it slowly, gray-blue eyes lingering over each sentence, and for the first time in years his smile formed without restraint, deepening the lines around his eyes in a way that felt natural rather than guarded. A second letter followed from Daniel Moore, written in neat, deliberate script, describing Ranger's enthusiastic attempts to chase butterflies and his surprising sensitivity to silence in the evenings, closing with the sentence, "He has already taught me more about courage than I expected." These messages, tucked carefully into Margaret's ledger, seemed to infuse the cabin with warmth beyond sunlight, and even Shadow, now the sole remaining pup at Hope's side, carried himself with an emerging calm, as if aware that his path might remain here. Margaret Collins, observing the quiet swell of goodwill, decided that Hope's story deserved preservation beyond spoken memory. She spent long afternoons at the kitchen table drafting an account in her precise looping hand, recounting the storm, the frozen arrival, the birth, and the transformation that followed, careful to emphasize not drama, but grace. She carried the manuscript one morning to the Boone County Gazette, where she met Samuel Hargrove, the paper's editor, a thin man in his early 60s with silver hair parted sharply to one side, wire-rimmed glasses perched low on a nose that seemed permanently dusted with printer's ink. Hargrove had built his modest publication on stories of local resilience rather than scandal, his temperament measured, his questions thoughtful, and as he read Margaret's pages his expression shifted from professional interest to quiet conviction. The article appeared 2 weeks later under the headline, "The House on the Hill," accompanied by a small photograph of Hope seated on the porch with Shadow at her side. The response exceeded expectation, letters and cards arriving not only from Boone, but from neighboring towns, some enclosing small donations despite Samuel's insistence on transparency and refusal of profit. He returned each monetary contribution with a handwritten note, explaining that support would be accepted only in the form of supplies or volunteer hours, and Margaret carefully recorded every exchange, ensuring clarity remained intact. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the ridge, casting long amber shadows across the yard, Samuel sat alone at the table reading again Hannah's drawing and Daniel's letter, feeling in his chest not pride, but something steadier, a recognition that what had begun in a storm had matured into connection. Hope rested near his boots, head lifted slightly, amber eyes following his expression, and Shadow lay stretched across the doorway, half inside and half out, embodying the threshold the cabin had become. Outside, Ethan Brooks passed by after finishing chores, pausing briefly to wave before continuing down the slope with easier steps than months before. Margaret entered quietly with a fresh pot of tea, glancing at the scattered envelopes and smiling as though she had anticipated this moment from the beginning. Samuel folded the letters carefully, placing them atop the ledger, and allowed himself a full, unguarded smile that reached his eyes, aware that gratitude had taken root not only in others, but within himself. The house on the hill was no longer defined by survival, but by stories carried outward and returned in ink and paper. And as twilight settled over Boone, he understood that the warmth filling the cabin now came not from the stove alone, but from words written in trust. Late summer in Boone carried a softness that blurred the edges of the Blue Ridge Mountains at dusk, a pale veil of mist rising from the valley each evening, as though the earth itself exhaled after a long day, and the house on the hill stood outlined against that haze, not as a solitary structure but as a quiet landmark. The porch light, once lit only out of habit, now glowed as invitation, and Samuel Hayes found himself leaving the door unlocked more often than not, trusting the rhythm that had formed around the cabin. Hope moved through the yard with calm vigilance, her amber eyes reflective rather than wary, while Shadow, now nearly full-grown, lean and strong with the thoughtful mask that had marked him since birth, kept close to her flank, his temperament steady, observant, inclined to watch before acting. Word of the house on the hill had traveled beyond Boone through the Gazette article and the letters that followed, and though Samuel remained deliberate about boundaries, The cabin increasingly became a place where people paused not only with animals in need, but with hearts heavy enough to seek quiet. One such evening, a woman named Laura Jenkins arrived alone, in her early 50s, tall and slender with ash-blonde hair pulled into a low twist at the nape of her neck, her complexion pale from months spent indoors, her movements precise yet restrained, as if conserving energy. She explained in a voice kept carefully level that her husband had passed unexpectedly that spring, and though she had no pet to leave, she had heard of the porch where one could sit without questions. Samuel studied her posture, the rigid shoulders, the clasped hands, and stepped aside without inquiry, gesturing toward the bench overlooking the slope. Margaret Collins joined them shortly after, bringing tea as naturally as breath, her silver braid catching the fading light, and she settled beside Laura without pressing conversation, allowing silence to stretch unforced. Hope approached, resting her head lightly against Laura's knee, and the woman's composure fractured briefly, tears falling without drama, absorbed into the fabric of the evening. Samuel remained a short distance away, hands resting on the porch rail, aware that what he offered now was not solution but space. The cabin's visitors grew varied. Thomas Green, a broad-chested man in his late 60s with a thick white beard and the weathered skin of someone who had worked outdoors most of his life, came weekly after closing his hardware store, claiming he needed to check the boards, though he lingered longer than necessary, speaking quietly with Samuel about aging and purpose. A young nurse named Amanda Clark, petite and quick-moving with dark curls framing an earnest face, stopped by after late hospital shifts, sitting with Shadow at her feet as she recounted the strain of tending to patients she could not always save. None of them arrived seeking spectacle, and none were turned away. Samuel kept the rules simple. Respect the animals, respect each other. Leave no trace of pity behind. Margaret's presence deepened not as romance but as partnership. She began bringing her own folding chair to the porch, her once tentative laughter now emerging more freely, and she and Samuel developed a rhythm of shared tasks, he splitting wood while she arranged wildflowers in mason jars, she reading aloud snippets from the Gazette while he repaired a loose hinge. Their conversations turned less toward what they had lost and more toward what remained possible. And there was comfort in the way they occupied space without pretense. Two seasoned lives aligned not by need, but by mutual regard. One evening, as fog rolled in early, thickening the valley below until only treetops pierced the white, Margaret stood beside Samuel, watching the porch light glow against the mist. "It looks like a lighthouse," she said softly, her voice free of wistfulness and rooted instead in contentment. Samuel considered the image, recognizing its truth. The light did not banish the fog but marked a point of steadiness within it. Inside, Laura Jenkins had begun volunteering to help with correspondence, her once rigid movements easing as she sorted letters at the kitchen table. And Ethan Brooks, taller now and more grounded, assisted Samuel with building a simple wooden sign at the base of the road reading "House on the Hill," carved in careful block letters that spoke of intention rather than advertisement. The sign stood modestly among wildflowers, and Samuel resisted adding any further explanation. Those who needed to find the place would understand its purpose without instruction. As summer edged toward early autumn, evenings grew cooler, and Samuel noticed a subtle shift within himself. The hours after sunset, once the most difficult stretch of any day, no longer pressed heavily against his chest. Instead of bracing for memories that once crowded in with the dark, he found that conversation, shared tea, the quiet breathing of hope and shadow, and the occasional laughter drifting across the porch filled the space that loneliness had occupied. One particular night, after the last visitor departed and Margaret had walked carefully down the path toward her farmhouse, Samuel remained seated alone beneath the porch light, watching the fog curl and lift slowly from the valley. Hope lay at his boots. Shadow sprawled across the threshold, half inside and half out as he had since youth, and the cabin behind him hummed with the settled warmth of a lived-in space. Samuel listened to the layered sounds, the distant call of an owl, the soft exhale of wind through trees, the steady breath of the dogs, and realized that darkness no longer felt like an adversary but like a companionable quiet. He did not fear the evening as he once had. It no longer carried only echoes of absence but held presence in its folds. When he finally rose to extinguish the porch light, the act felt not like retreat but routine, and as he stepped inside, closing the door gently against the mist, he understood that the house on the hill had become more than shelter for animals, or even for neighbors. It had become a place where night itself could be met without dread. Spring returned to the Blue Ridge not as a repetition of the season before, but as something fuller, steadier. The hills layered in tender green beneath a sky washed clean by recent rain, and the house on the hill stood bathed in mild sunlight that lingered longer each evening as though reluctant to depart. Samuel Hayes leaned against the porch rail, sleeves rolled back over forearms, still strong despite the silver threading his hair. The lines at the corners of his gray-blue eyes deepened not by strain now, but by use, and at his feet hope rested with the composed assurance of a creature who had endured and emerged whole. Her coat gleamed in bands of sable and gold, her body fully recovered, the pale ring at her neck no longer a mark of suffering but of survival, and beside her shadow, no longer a pup but a young dog of quiet intelligence, bounded after drifting leaves in exaggerated bursts of seriousness that made Margaret laugh softly from her chair. Margaret Collins had changed in ways subtle yet unmistakable. Her posture had straightened with purpose, silver braid now often replaced by loose waves brushing her shoulders. Pale skin warmed by time spent outdoors rather than confined to rooms, and though grief had not left her, it had settled into something companionable rather than crushing. She sat with a teacup balanced carefully in her hands, eyes tracing the arc of Shadow's movement across the grass, and after a long silence she spoke not loudly but clearly. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles with thunder. He sends a weary soul looking for shelter. Samuel glanced toward her, not startled by the statement but recognizing in it the echo of everything the cabin had come to mean, and he felt again that deep alignment he had first sensed on the night hope crossed his threshold. Visitors still arrived, though less urgently now. Ethan Brooks, taller and broader in the shoulders, stopped by after school wearing confidence like a newly fitted coat. His dark hair trimmed neatly, freckles visible against sun-touched skin, speaking of vocational training in animal care with a determination that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Laura Jenkins volunteered twice weekly, her ash-blonde hair now worn loose rather than tightly twisted. Grief still present, but no longer the sole definition of her days, and she often sat with Margaret to help coordinate schedules for short-term guests. Dr. Emily Carter visited to perform routine checkups, smiling at Hope's vitality and at Shadow's steady gaze, remarking that the dog possessed the temperament of a natural guardian. Even Deputy Tom Reeves occasionally stopped by without official pretext, removing his hat to sit briefly on the porch and comment on how the ridge looked from that vantage point. Yet, on this particular afternoon, the cabin felt unhurried, unburdened by need. Sunlight pooled across the boards, birds stitched thin songs through the trees, and Samuel allowed himself to sit without scanning for problems to solve. He thought of the first storm, of the frozen silhouette against white, of how easily he might have closed the door and retreated into solitude, and he understood now that strength had not been the defining trait in that moment. Willingness had. Hope shifted closer, pressing lightly against his boot, and he bent to rest a hand against her warm shoulder, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath fur that had once been rigid with ice. Margaret rose and stepped nearer the edge of the porch, gazing down the slope where the modest wooden sign reading House on the Hill stood among wildflowers, its letters weathered but clear. "You didn't rescue her alone," she said gently, not as correction, but as affirmation. Samuel nodded, aware that the statement ran both directions. Hope had not come merely to be saved, and the people who found their way here had not come solely for animals. They had come for space, for steadiness, for permission to breathe. Shadow trotted back toward the porch, tail high, pausing to sit upright at Hope's side as if aware of ceremony in the air, and Samuel found himself smiling in a way that reached deeper than expression. He felt no need to narrate the transformation, no desire to elevate it into legend. The miracle, if it was one, had unfolded in ordinary days, in ledger entries and teacups and steady presence. He looked out over the valley, where mist rose lightly in the distance but no longer obscured the horizon, and understood that fear of evening had dissolved not because darkness vanished, but because light had found a place to dwell within it. When the sun dipped lower, casting amber across Hope's coat and Shadow's attentive face, Samuel remained seated, hands relaxed, no longer bracing for loss or rehearsing solitude. He had not been chosen for the cabin because he was the strongest man on the ridge. He had been chosen because he opened the door. Hope lifted her head, amber eyes meeting his in quiet acknowledgement, and for a suspended moment the exchange held everything words might have failed to contain. Margaret returned to her chair, content, the breeze lifting a strand of silver hair across her cheek, and the house on the hill stood not as monument but as home. Home to Hope, to Shadow, to those who needed pause, and to a man who finally understood that rescue sometimes arrives disguised as responsibility. As twilight deepened and the porch light flickered on, Samuel did not feel the old tightening in his chest. Instead, he felt gratitude settle into him like evening dew, and he knew with steady certainty that Hope had not come to be saved alone. She had come to save him, and in doing so had turned a solitary cabin into a shelter of hope for an entire ridge. In the end, the miracle was never the storm stopping or the town gathering or even the safe birth of 3 small lives. The miracle was quieter than that. It was a door opened when it would have been easier to stay closed. It was a heart that chose to remain soft after loss. Sometimes God does not move mountains in a single moment. Sometimes He sends a weary soul to your doorstep and waits to see if you will make room. In our daily lives, miracles rarely arrive with thunder. They come in the form of interruptions, responsibilities, people who need patience, and chances to love again when we thought we were finished. If this story has touched you, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what this story means to you. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, redemption, and quiet courage. May God bless you and your home, strengthen your heart in difficult seasons, and place gentle light on your path wherever you walk.